Hey there, students. So in this video today, I'm going to go over some matching. So direct materials, labor, and overhead. The three most essential costs in this class. Those three components make up a product. You have to know how they work. And so I'm going to give you a ton of examples to understand what is considered a material, what's considered a labor, and what's considered overhead. Overhead is the most difficult one because it's like everything else. You got your materials, labor, and then whatever else is needed to make that product, but you can't directly trace it to that product. That's called overhead. And you have to know a lot of examples of that. And I'll give you a ton in this matching exercise. You also need to know what everything else is that's considered selling and administrative costs. And we'll go over that too. So, let's go ahead and practice here and we'll get the hang of it. All right, so we're going to choose between these 5 categories. So number 1, factory supplies. So when I see the word factory, we talked about this. Think product cost. And what's a product cost? Well, product cost is going to be either materials, labor, or overhead. One of those 3. So cool, we've narrowed it down to one of those 3. Now let's look at supplies. Well, that's a tricky one. You're like, well, supplies are a material. Not really. Supplies are everything else that's needed. Let's say you're building a car, right? So what do you need to build that car? Well, you might need an engine. An engine is an essential material to build that car. But what about a hammer or a screwdriver? Well, you're like, well, you don't put the hammer inside the car to make it run. At least I hope they don't. But the hammer and the screwdriver are needed to assemble that car. Do you see that distinction there? You need those tools to help build the car, but those tools aren't part of the car. I hope you see that. So, like I said, supplies would be like a hammer and any other tools you need. You can just call it tools. It's not part of the car itself, but it's needed to assemble that car. So we call that overhead. It's everything else that's needed to build that car. So that's what that is. C for overhead. That's the hardest one there. So many students struggle with that fact. It's like, oh, we're building a house, so we need some, I don't know. No, not a house. Let's say you're building something that requires glue. Glue isn't part of the product. You're not putting glue into the product to help build it, but you need glue to assemble it. That's another good example. They call that indirect materials, or they call it supplies. We're going to talk more about that later. That's the trickiest one. General accounting costs. I see the word general. When I think general, I think administrative. It's general. It's not part of the product, but you need it as part of the organization to keep it running. Factory. What do you think of factory? You think product. So it's part of the product, so it's either materials, labor, or overhead. Security costs. Well, the factory needs security, right? Because people can come in and potentially trespass on the property. That's bad. So they have a security guard there. Security is necessary, but it's not directly part of the product. So what do they call that? They call that overhead. Again, it's needed to build the product, right? Security has to be there so that everyone can work on the product in a safe environment. But it's not directly used in building that product, so they call that overhead. Cost of tires. Well, if you're building a car, a tire is essential to build that car. You need the tire for the car to work. So that's a material. Salary of chief executive officer. Well, chief executive officer, he's not working in that factory, is he? He's somewhere else. He's in an office building somewhere, or the headquarters. So they call that an administrative cost. He's somewhere else. He's not part of the factory. So that's kind of the question you ask yourself. Are any of these costs needed for the factory? If you say yes, it's materials, labor, overhead. If you think, okay, that cost is not part of the factory, All right, it's got to be either a selling or administrative cost. That's how it goes. All right, factory janitorial costs. Well, I see the word factory, so it's either materials, labor, or overhead, and it's a janitor. He's there to clean the factory, but he's not making that product, right? So he'd be considered overhead, which is C. Costs of windshields used in the production process. Well, to build that car, you need a windshield. That's an essential material. So that's A, direct materials. The depreciation of vehicles used by sales personnel. This is a really important word there. So depreciation of equipment used in the factory, well, it's factory related. Depreciation is called overhead when it's in the factory. However, depreciation of vehicles used by the sales guys are not in the factory. They're outside the factory. So it's not going to be a material, labor, or overhead. They call that a selling expense, right? Because those sales guys, they need to be there to sell those cars, right? They're not building the car, but they're necessary to sell them. So depreciation related to those sales guys, it's called a selling expense. I think you're getting the hang of it here. It's important that you understand that anything related with the factory is considered part of the product. And if it's part of the product, it's materials, labor, overhead. If it's not part of the factory, it's outside. So it's considered either a selling expense or an administrative expense. So if you're faced with a question like this on your test, ask yourself that question. Is it factory related? If you say yes, it's got to be materials, labor, overhead. Ask yourself, is it not factory related? If you say yes, then it's not part of that product. It's either selling or administrative. Rewind that if you need to. Ask yourself that question every time. We'll stop here for now. I have another matching exercise using the same information, labor, materials, overhead, selling, and administrative. But we'll break it up in two. So cool. Thanks for watching today. Hopefully this was helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.